The midday sun hung over the valley like a hot iron plate, baking the dust along the county road until the air above it shivered with heat. On the rise where the town had staked out the foundation for the new county schoolhouse, Gideon Hale stood with his boots set wide in the red dirt, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of a 53-year-old frame that had known little else besides heavy stone and long silences. He carried his grey hair cut short and practical, the skin at the corners of his eyes permanently creased from 3 decades of squinting across limestone quarries and reading the grey grain of the earth. In his left hand he held a cedar tallyboard, its surface marked with neat, dark columns of numbers. He was calculating the board feet of joist timber required to set the ground floor, running the sum through his head with the quiet rhythm of a man who trusted arithmetic far more than he trusted promises. The crunch of wagon wheels on gravel broke the stillness. Gideon did not look up immediately. He finished the sum in his head, carried the 3, and marked the total into the soft cedar with the tip of a lead carpenter pencil. Only then did he turn his head to watch the light buckboard pull up beside the timber stack. Rachel Sterling climbed down from the seat before the horses had even brought the wheels to a complete stop. She moved with the unhurried, muscular economy of a woman who had spent half her 29 years lifting 50-pound sacks of quicklime and balancing on scaffolding boards. She was tall, built with broad ribs and long, powerful forearms that bore the light, pale scars of hot mortar splatters against skin darkened to the color of a cured walnut by the prairie sun. She wore a heavy canvas apron tied low over her hips, the pockets stiffened with dry lime dust, and carried a worn leather tool roll tucked firmly under one arm. She did not offer a greeting. She did not introduce herself, nor did she wait for Gideon to step off the foundation ledge. Rachel walked straight past the stacks of white pine joists, her boots moving over the rough site with the specific efficiency of someone who had grown up around open footings and unguarded trenches. She stopped at the south wall, where the new limestone foundation rose 4 courses high out of the earth, and dropped onto one knee in the dirt. From the leather roll she pulled a 6-inch steel trowel, its cherrywood handle darkened by the oil of her father's hands before it had become hers. She did not ask permission. She brought the butt of the handle against the fresh mortar line between the second and third courses, tapping the grey joint 3 times in quick, practiced succession. The sound that returned was not the solid, ringing thud of cured masonry. It was a dull, papery click, followed by a faint trickle of grey sand that spilled out of the joint and pulled on the toe of her boot. "Your lime mortar is cracking, Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was flat and low, stripped of any polite preamble, carrying the weight of a woman who dealt only in physical facts. "You used silty creek sand instead of washed river grit, and it will slough off before the first frost hits the valley." Gideon did not take offense. He did not posture, nor did he offer the predictable defenses of a man accustomed to being the sole authority on a job site. He simply lowered his tally board to his side, stepped down off the wall footing, and knelt in the dust 18 inches from her. He reached out with 2 thick, calloused fingers, scooped up a pinch of the dry grit that had fallen onto her boot, and rubbed it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. He smelled it, felt the faint, slick residue of organic silt lingering in the grain, and then looked up. His grey eyes met her hazel ones in a steady, unblinking hold. For 3 long seconds, neither of them spoke. It was the silent assessment of 2 crafts who spoke the same hard language of weights, measures, and materials. In her eyes, Gideon did not see the soft, tentative deference the townspeople usually expected from women, nor did he see the performative gentleness that made him feel so bulky and out of place in town drawing rooms. He saw only competence, raw and undisputed. He calculated the sum of her presence instantly. Her eye had caught in 3 seconds a flaw that his supplier had hidden under a top-dress of clean sand, saving him $400 in structural repairs before the roof timbering was even raised. "I bought 6 loads from the Mill Creek pit," Gideon said, his voice deep and dry as dry-stack shale. The teamster swore it was washed twice. "The teamster lied to save a 2-mile haul from the river," Rachel replied, her gaze remaining locked onto his without a flicker of hesitation. "Silt holds moisture until the heat hits it, then it shrinks and pulls away from the lime matrix. You have 80 linear feet of wall laid up with a mix that will fail the moment the ground freezes and heaves." Gideon stood up slowly, the joints in his knees making a dry pop in the hot air. He looked at the 4 courses of stone, then down at the woman still kneeling in the dirt with the steel trowel resting across her knee. "Can you slake a fresh batch and save the wall before it sets fully?" he asked. "I can scrape the outer 2 inches of joint, slake 3 barrels of high-calcium lime with coarse river sand, and point it back up so it holds for 50 years, she said, standing up to her full height. "But it will cost you $3 a day. and I take no orders on the mix from a man who doesn't check his own sand. Gideon looked at her sun-darkened face, at the dust settled in the creases of her work shirt, and at the absolute lack of apology in her posture. He did not offer a hand to shake. He merely nodded once, a sharp, clean motion of his chin. "The river sand is 2 miles west," Gideon said. "The team leaves at 5 in the morning. Be on the seat, Miss Sterling. You are the chief plasterer and inspector for this build." The arrangement was struck without a single unnecessary word, born not of charm or courtship, but of an immediate, mutual recognition of necessity. By the second week, the rhythm of the schoolhouse site had settled into a quiet, relentless precision. The sun rose over the eastern ridges each morning at 6, casting long, sharp shadows of the scaffold frames across the dirt, and found Gideon and Rachel already at work. They worked with very little speech, for speech required breath, and breath was better spent moving stone and lifting hods of plaster. Gideon watched her work whenever the rhythm of his own labour allowed it. He stood on the upper staging, shaping corner coins with his 3-pound stone hammer, his eyes drifting down to where Rachel stood at the mixing trough. She worked with the repetitive, rhythmic phrasing of a master of her trade. Up, smooth, press, pull. Up, smooth, press, pull. She would scoop a measure of heavy lime paste onto her aluminum hawk, step to the lath wall, and sweep the steel trowel upward in one fluid, unbroken arc. The sound was a steady, rhythmic hiss against the wooden laths, a sound that spoke of perfect moisture balance, correct pressure, and an absolute lack of wasted motion. She did not pause to wipe the sweat from her forehead. She simply tilted her head slightly to let it drip clear of her work, her body moving in a continuous, mechanical grace that ignored the heat entirely. Gideon made his calculations as he watched her. In his 53 years, he had seen many men work, and most worked with a posture of resistance, fighting the stone, complaining of the heat, or leaning against the staging whenever his back was turned. Rachel Sterling worked in the posture of someone who had long ago accepted the physical reality of the world, and had chosen to master it rather than bargain with it. Her presence on the site was an entry on the credit side of his life's balance sheet. Where other contractors had to spend hours checking measurements and correcting sloppy mortar lines, Gideon found himself moving ahead with his framing, knowing without looking that any surface Rachel touched was true, plumb, and permanent. He noticed, too, the subtle details that the rest of the town overlooked or condemned. He saw the way she carefully scraped her trowels clean at the end of every shift, oiling the steel with lard so it would not pit overnight. He saw the strength in her shoulders, a strength that came from years of honest timbering and plaster mixing, and he found in that strength a profound, grounding comfort. To Gideon, whose life had been spent surrounded by the heavy, unyielding silence of stone, her competence was a language far sweeter than any delicate conversation he had ever heard spoken in a parlour. Their communication became an unspoken system of signs and shared effort. They did not make grand gestures. Instead, romance took the shape of practical service, quiet and unnoticed by anyone who might pass along the road. When the midday sun reached its zenith, turning the lime mixing trough into a blinding mirror of white heat, Gideon did not offer poetry or compliments about her appearance. Instead, he took 2 hours after his evening shift, when his muscles were already aching from hauling granite boulders, and built a thick cedar canopy over her mixing station. He used heavy 3x5 posts and thatched the roof with fresh green oak boughs to block the direct rays of the sun, ensuring that her lime paste would not dry out prematurely, and that her neck and arms would be spared the worst of the afternoon glare. When Rachel arrived at dawn the next morning and saw the canopy standing solid and square over her trough, she did not cry out in surprise or offer a effusive speech of thanks. She walked up to the corner post, pushed against it with her full weight to test its bracing, and found it immovable. She looked across the site to where Gideon was sharpening a stone chisel on a wet grinding wheel. He did not look up, but he felt her gaze resting on him. She held his eyes across 30 yards of dusty construction ground, her expression calm, her jaw set, conveying a deep, unshakable gratitude that no spoken words could have carried. She simply picked up her bucket, filled it with water from the well, and got to work under the cool shade he had built for her. In turn, Rachel's care for him showed itself in the quiet arithmetic of his needs. She noticed within 3 days that Gideon carried his weight slightly off-center when he worked on the east footing, favoring his right knee where an old quarry slide had pinched him 20 years prior. She said nothing about it. But each morning before he arrived, she quietly shifted the heavy stone blocks closer to his working height using a lever bar, arranging them on sturdy oak horses so he would not have to bend his knee past 90 degrees to lift them. He noticed the change immediately. He recognized that his comfort had been calculated, measured, and provided for by a woman who noticed the specifics of his physical existence without feeling the need to make a spectacle of her charity. They ate their midday bread sitting 10 feet apart on the shade timber, watching the red dust settle on the road. They did not speak of their pasts, nor did they speak of the lonely years that lay behind them both, his long, solitary nights on his outlying ranch, or her quiet years running a trade in a county that looked at her work as a strange, unladylike eccentricity. They spoke of the work. They spoke of the slaking time of quicklime, the tensile strength of hickory wall pegs, and the coming autumn weather that would dictate when the final scratch coat of plaster must be finished. Yet, in that shared silence, structured entirely by the rhythm of physical labor and absolute competence, a foundation was being laid far deeper and far truer than the limestone courses beneath the schoolhouse walls. They were two people who had eliminated friction from their daily lives through discipline and skill, and in each other, they had finally found a surface that did not give way under pressure. By the third week of construction, the framework of the schoolhouse stood tall against the pale prairie sky, its heavy white pine rafters locking into place under Gideon's steady mallet. Rachel had begun the interior lathing, her hands moving with blinding speed as she tacked the thin wooden strips across the studding, leaving a precise quarter-inch gap between each for the plaster key. The rhythm of the site was an unbroken clockwork of hammer strikes, scraping trowels, and the dry, sweet smell of fresh sawdust mixed with damp lime. The interruption came on a Thursday morning when the sun was barely 2 hours above the horizon. The sound of high-wheeled carriages cutting through the gravel announced the arrival of visitors long before they reached the site perimeter. Gideon paused with his hand on a framing square as 3 men stepped down from a polished black buggy. At the head of the group was Silas Vance, the senior county alderman and president of the school board. Vance was a soft-palmed man who wore a dark wool coat despite the August humidity, his posture stiff with the small, aggressive authority of a town official accustomed to deference. Behind him stood 2 other board members, their hats pulled low, clutching leather-bound folders against their chests like shields. Vance did not walk onto the dirt site. He stopped at the edge of the timber pile, daintily stepping over a pile of oak wood shavings as if they were offal. His eyes swept past Gideon, past the plumb lines hanging from the corner posts, and locked squarely onto Rachel. She was standing 6 feet up on a staging plank, a canvas apron caked in dry lime tied over her work trousers, her tall frame leaning over a mortar board as she worked a fresh batch of base coat plaster. "Hale," Vance called out, his voice sharp and metallic against the open space. "Down here. We have an urgent matter to address regarding this contract." Gideon did not hurry. He laid his square down on a flat joist, wiped his palms on his thigh, and stepped down from the staging with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped 5 feet from Vance, his broad form blotting out the morning light behind him, his grey eyes cold and unreadable. "Alderman," Gideon said, "the timber framing is 3 days ahead of schedule. You can inspect the corner lap joints if you are here for the walk-through." "I am not here to inspect timber, Hale," Vance said, fanning himself with his hat, though his eyes remained fixed on Rachel, who had not stopped her trowel. She continued her upward sweep, the steady hiss of plaster keying into the wood laths filling the silence between them. Up, smooth, press, pull. Up, smooth, press, pull. "The board has received multiple complaints from the citizens of this town," Vance continued, lowering his voice to a theatrical whisper that carried easily across the quiet site. "It has come to our attention that you have hired a woman to perform heavy masonry and plastering labor on a public municipal building. A building where our children will be educated. She is the lead plasterer," Gideon said simply. "It is an outrage to public decency, Hale," Vance barked, stepping forward, his face flushing red under his high collar. A woman covered in lime dust, wearing men's overalls, swinging trowels alongside male laborists on a county contract. "The town is talking. It is dirty, unladylike work, and it reflects poorly on the morality of this council. We will not have the children's school built by an unseemly spectacle. You will discharge her immediately and hire a proper tradesman from the valley." Rachel's trowel froze against the lath. She did not turn around immediately. She stood on the high plank, her shoulders square, her fingers gripping the wooden handle of her tool until her knuckles turned white under the sun-darkened skin. She had heard these whispers all her life, in the town square, outside the dry goods store, behind the lace curtains of women who had never known the weight of an honest day's labor. The familiar, cold ache of self-consciousness tightened in her chest, the old feeling that her strength, her dark skin, and her father's trade made her a creature unfit for decent society. She began to lower her arms, preparing to pack her leather roll and step down, accepting the familiar arithmetic of exclusion that had governed her youth. Before her boot could find the ladder rung, Gideon moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not wave his hands or gesticulate. Gideon simply took 2 long strides and placed his massive, broad-shouldered frame directly between Alderman Vance and the base of Rachel's staging. He stood like a grey granite ledge thrown across a narrow canyon, his arms hanging loose by his sides, his chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. "Rachel Sterling is the chief plasterer and masonry inspector on this job," Gideon said. His voice was low, carrying a vibrating resonance that seemed to come from deep within the earth beneath their feet. "She knows more about lime chemistry and wall strength than any man in this county, including myself." "That is irrelevant, Hale," Vance snapped, taking a step back from Gideon's shadow. "The board dictates who is suitable for municipal labor. You will replace her by tomorrow morning, or we will review your contract." Gideon looked down at the alderman. He did not consult a ledger or pause to calculate the financial ruin a cancelled contract would bring to his solitary ranch. He looked Vance directly in the eye, holding his gaze with an absolute, terrifying calm. "You will not review my contract, Alderman," Gideon said, each word spoken with the heavy precision of a stone dropped into a dry well. "If Rachel Sterling's trowel leaves this site, my hammers stop this instant. I will pull my men, I will break my contract, and I will pack my tools. You can take your public decency down to the creek and attempt to build your own schoolhouse out of mud before the November rain ruins your open footings." Silence descended over the site, thick and suffocating. The 2 board members behind Vance shifted uncomfortably, eyeing the exposed wall studs and the piles of unlaid timber. They knew as well as Vance that no other contractor in 3 counties had the equipment or the skill to finish the schoolhouse before winter set in. To break the contract meant leaving the county's children without a roof for another year and facing the wrath of the town taxpayers. Vance's mouth opened, then snapped shut. His face turned a deep, mottled purple. He looked past Gideon's broad shoulder at Rachel, who remained standing on a scaffold, watching Gideon's back with wide, motionless eyes. "This is not over, Hale," Vance spat, adjusting his coat with jerked, nervous movements. "The board will hold a formal meeting on this matter." "Keep your meeting," Gideon replied, turning his back on the alderman before the man had even reached his carriage. "Just make sure you do it on your own time. We have work to do here." As the carriage rattled away in a cloud of bitter red dust, Gideon stepped back toward his stone pile, picking up his chisel as if nothing had occurred. He did not look up at Rachel to demand gratitude, nor did he offer a grand speech about chivalry. He simply returned to his labor, his posture as steady and unbothered as the granite he shaped. Above him, Rachel remained still on her plank. Her chest felt tight, filled with a strange, unfamiliar warmth that threatened to overwhelm her usual stoic restraint. For 29 years, she had fought her own battles, shielding her heart behind a wall of competence and silence. No man had ever stood between her and the cold judgments of the world. No man had ever placed his own livelihood on the line merely to defend the value of her hands. She looked down at Gideon's grey head as he struck his chisel, the rhythmic chink-chink-chink of steel on stone ringing out once more. She held his gaze for a single, fleeting second when he looked up to clear the stone dust from his work. In that unuttered look, a quiet covenant was sealed between them, a debt of respect that no currency could settle. That night, long after the rest of the crew had departed and the site lay dark under a quarter moon, Rachel did not go straight to her rented room in town. She walked to her small workshop behind her father's old barn. By the yellow light of a single coal oil lamp, she pulled a block of wet, fine-grained molding plaster onto her workbench. She did not draw a pattern on paper. She knew the measurements of Gideon's personal house, the solitary, unpainted pine home he had been slowly building alone on his ranch for 5 years during his brief spare hours. She knew the parlor ceiling had an 8-foot center span that sat empty, waiting for a finish that a busy man never had time to apply. Rachel picked up her smallest carving gouge. With steady, surgical movements, she began to carve a decorative ceiling medallion out of the plaster block. She worked through the night, her long fingers moving with delicate, powerful grace, shaping intricate oak leaves and trailing acorns into the soft, white lime. It was a masterpiece of fine plasterwork, unnecessary for structure, useless for utility, but rich with a silent, permanent beauty. It was the only way she knew how to speak her heart, through the silent, enduring perfection of her craft. Now, friends, isn't that just like a good man? Standing tall for a woman who knows the value of hard work, even when the rest of the town forgets their manners. If you believe in honest work and a man who keeps his word, take a quick moment right now to hit that like button, Drop a comment below letting me know where you're listening from, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps our little corner of the frontier grow. The morning following Vance's visit brought a subtle, hostile shift in the town's climate. While Vance had lacked the legal authority to summarily fire Rachel without board approval, he possessed other, quieter levers of power. By noon, the Riversand hauler, a local man who owed Vance money on a store credit ledger, arrived at the site with an empty wagon, claiming his draft horses had gone lame and he could no longer haul the clean river grit required for Rachel's plaster mix. Without that washed grit, the interior wall coats could not proceed. The deadline for the county inspector's arrival was less than 4 days away, and if the plastering was not complete and dry, the county would forfeit Gideon's performance bond. Gideon did not spend an hour cursing Vance or arguing with the teamster. He listened to the man's weak excuses with a flat, indifferent face, nodded once, and walked straight to his own heavy supply wagon. "We have 4 tons of river sand stockpiled at my personal quarry bed 2 miles up the creek," Gideon told Rachel, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "It is unwashed, but the grain is sharp and coarse. If we haul it ourselves and wash it through a screen today, we can stay on schedule. It will take 16 hours of continuous shoveling and hauling," Rachel said, looking at the setting sun and calculating the weight against their physical endurance. "We will have to work through the night by lantern light to have the sand ready for tomorrow's coat." "Then we had better start shoveling," Gideon replied simply. They drove the heavy team up into the dark timber of the creek bed as twilight fell over the valley. The air grew cold and damp along the water, a stark contrast to the baked heat of the daytime construction site. By the light of 4 glass lanterns hung from the wagon bows, they went to work at the sandbank. There was no grand drama to the night, only the grueling, repetitive reality of physical labor. Gideon stood in the pit, his broad back glistening with sweat under his linen shirt, driving the flathead shovel deep into the river bar and tossing heavy, damp loads over the high sideboards of the wagon. Rachel stood in the bed, catching the sand on a fine wire screen, rocking the frame back and forth with rhythmic, powerful thrusts of her arms to separate the coarse stone from the silt before sluicing clean well water over the mesh. Up, toss, shake, wash. Up, toss, shake, wash. The rhythm was brutal, a relentless test of muscle and sinew against time and gravity. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the cold air bit at their skin, but both of them were soaked in perspiration. Neither of them complained. They worked as a perfectly balanced engine, 2 physical beings moving in absolute harmony, predicting each other's movements without a word spoken. When Gideon's shovel hit a buried granite rock, Rachel was already there with the iron crowbar to clear the obstruction. When Rachel's hand slipped slightly on the wet frame of the screen from sheer fatigue, Gideon reached out with a massive, mud-stained hand, steadying the wood frame without a word, holding her eyes in the lantern light until she regained her footing. In that silent, midnight labor, surrounded by the rush of the cold creek water and the dark forest, the last lingering boundaries between them dissolved. They were not a contractor and a hired laborer. They were 2 souls forged from the same unyielding timber, bound together by a shared refusal to be broken by the small, petty malice of lesser people. By 5 in the morning, as the first faint grey light of dawn crept over the eastern ridges, the heavy wagon sat loaded to the wheel hubs with 3 tons of pristine, washed river sand. Gideon climbed up onto the driver's bench, his shoulders aching, his hands stiff from 6 hours of relentless shoveling. He looked over at Rachel, who sat beside him on the wooden seat, her tall frame leaning slightly back against the sand sacks, her face smudged with dry mud, her long dark eyelashes heavy with sleep. He pulled his heavy wool coat off the back frame of the seat, a thick, worn garment smelling of cedar smoke and pine resin, and gently laid it over her shoulders to keep off the damp dawn chill. Rachel opened her eyes slowly. She did not pull away from the coat. She drew the heavy wool tighter around her collar, feeling the warmth of his body still trapped in the lining. She looked at Gideon's profile as he took the leather reins in his calloused hands, his strong, square jaw, the grey hair silvered by the early morning light, the utter dependability written into every line of his posture. "Thank you, Gideon," she whispered, her voice low and soft in the quiet morning air. Gideon did not turn his head, but his hands tightened on the leather reins, and a subtle, soft crease appeared at the corner of his eye. "Save your thanks, Miss Sterling," he said quietly, his tone rich with a deep, unshakable comfort. "We have 3 coats of plaster to lay before nightfall." The 4th week of the build arrived under a sky the color of bruised slate, heavy with the promise of early autumn rains. The interior of the schoolhouse was nearly complete, the smooth, pale surfaces of Rachel's plaster work gleaming in the dim light of the high windows. Every wall stood plumb and solid, her lime mixture curing into a seamless, dense shell that resonated with a clean, tight ring whenever a fingernail tapped its surface. It happened in the dark hours 3 days before the final county inspection. At 2 in the morning, a sudden, deep groan echoed up from the subterranean rock beneath the valley. The earth bucked, a sharp, violent fault-line tremor that lasted less than 10 seconds, but carried enough kinetic fury to rattle glass out of frames and knock oil lamps from their pegs across 3 townships. On Gideon's ranch, the horses kicked wildly in their stalls as the timber rafters groaned above his head. He was out of bed before the shaking stopped, pulling his boots on in the dark, his mind immediately calculating the stress tolerances of green framing timber and uncued mortar joints. He rode his horse hard through the night mist, arriving at the schoolhouse site just as the first cold light of dawn broke through the clouds. A crowd had already gathered in the town square 2 miles back. The old brick chimney on Alderman Vance's 2-story dry goods store had sheared clean off at the roofline, dropping 2,000 pounds of loose, silty mortar and soft brick through the front porch roof. The facade of the municipal hall bore a jagged, 3-inch crack running from the foundation straight up through the window header, a fatal structural shear caused by rigid, unyielding cement laid up by cheap labor. Gideon swung down from his saddle at the schoolhouse site and found Rachel already there. She was standing in her canvas apron, lantern in hand, kneeling at the base of the south wall where the ground had settled nearly 2 inches along the drainage ditch. Gideon dropped to his knees beside her, his chest heaving from the ride. He did not ask if she was all right. He looked at her hands, saw they were steady, and then looked at the stone foundation. The earth had moved, but the wall had not parted. Where the municipal hall's rigid cement had snapped under the lateral shear, Rachel's slaked lime mortar, mixed with coarse, washed river sand and slaked with exact precision, had flexed just enough to absorb the movement without breaking its bond. The lime had self-healed, settling into the shift without a single hairline fracture along the entire 80-foot line. Inside, the story was the same. The scratch and finish coats of plaster on the high-ceiling laths stood flawless, without a single crack or flake on the surface. Her work had held the timber frame rigid, binding the whole building into a single, indestructible unit. By 8 o'clock, a procession of town council members, led by a pale, shaken Alderman Vance, arrived at the schoolhouse. Vance's coat was covered in red brick dust from his ruined storefront, his hands trembling as he stared at the pristine, unmarked walls of the schoolhouse. He walked the perimeter twice, running his soft fingers over the mortar joints, desperately searching for a flaw to justify his previous arrogance. He found none. Gideon stepped up beside the board, holding a steel plumb line in his thick hand. He dropped the brass bob along the main corner coin. It hung perfectly straight, dead center over the footing mark. The lime flexed. "Alderman," Gideon said, his voice flat, carrying no tone of triumph, only the undeniable weight of physical truth. A rigid wall snaps when the earth moves. A proper lime joint, mixed by someone who knows her trade, moves with the earth and stays standing. You lost your storefront because you bought cheap mortar laid up by men who hurried the job. This schoolhouse will still be standing when our grandchildren are old. Vance looked at the plumb line, then at Gideon's steady, unyielding face, and finally at Rachel, who stood by her mixing trough with her trowel tucked under her arm. The alderman opened his mouth to speak, but no arguments remained in his ledger. The math was absolute. Her labor had saved the county thousands of dollars and provided the only safe shelter in the entire valley. The council chairman stepped forward, pushing past Vance without a word. He looked at Gideon, then held his hand out to Rachel. "Miss Sterling," the chairman said, his voice quiet with genuine humility, "the municipal hall roof is unsafe, and the council room needs an entire rebuild. We would be honored if you and Mr. Hale would take the contract to restore the town center. Name your price for the lime work." Rachel looked at the chairman's outstretched hand. She did not preen, nor did she gloat. She wiped her right palm on her canvas apron, took his hand in her strong, calloused grip, and gave it one firm, businesslike shake. "My price is $3.50 a day," Rachel said clearly. "And I inspect all the sand myself." The contract was signed on the hood of Gideon's supply wagon 10 minutes later. By late afternoon, the clouds parted, leaving the sky clear and washed clean by the morning wind. The schoolhouse was finished, the tools wiped clean and packed into their leather rolls, and the site cleared of debris. The quiet returned to the hill, a soft, peaceful stillness that felt entirely different from the lonely silence that had defined both their lives before the first stone was laid. Gideon walked up to Rachel as she tied the canvas straps on her tool bag. "The wagon is loaded," Gideon said softly. "Come up to the ranch, Rachel." I have something on the ceiling that needs your inspection before the light fails. She looked at him, seeing the quiet, steady warmth behind his grey eyes, and nodded once. She climbed onto the high seat of his wagon, leaving her own buckboard tied behind. They drove 2 miles south out of town, turning off the main road onto a winding timber track that led up through a grove of white oaks to his solitary ranch. The house was built of heavy, hand-hewn logs and quarry stone, sitting square against the slope of the hill. It was a sturdy, honest building, but it bore the unfinished marks of a man who worked long hours for others and left his own comfort for last. Gideon opened the heavy oak front door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The parlor was cool and quiet, smelling of cured pine and beeswax. Rachel walked into the center of the room and looked up. There, mounted perfectly in the dead center of the 5-inch pine ceiling joists, was a plaster medallion. Gideon had carved out the mounting plate himself, setting her white plaster oak leaves and trailing acorns flush against the dark wood. He had polished the plaster until it shone like old ivory, every delicate vein in the leaves highlighted by the soft afternoon light streaming through the south window. Rachel stood motionless under the medallion, her breath catching in her throat. She had carved it in the dark hours of a cold night as a silent token of gratitude, never asking if he had a place for it, never expecting it to be given the place of honor in his home. "You said it," she whispered, her voice dropping its usual sharp edge, revealing the soft, tender core she had kept hidden behind her strength for so long. "I spent 3 hours getting it level," Gideon said, stepping up behind her. He did not touch her, but his broad presence was a wall of warmth at her back. "A house without a finish is just a shelter against the rain, Rachel. It takes a master's hand to make it a home." Rachel turned around slowly to face him. In the quiet room, stripped of the noise of iron trowels and hammer strikes, they stood closer than they ever had before. Gideon looked down at her sun-darkened face, at the small, fine lines around her eyes, at her strong, beautiful hands that had labored so hard beside his own. He spoke without grand flourish, using the only vocabulary that felt honest enough for the moment. "Rachel, my life's ledger has been 53 years of solitary hard work," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he had carried in silence for months. It was a lot of stone moved and a lot of timber cut, but there was no balance on the side that mattered. "I don't know how to offer fine poetry or sweet talk, but I know arithmetic. I know that every day you are on a job site with me, the work is lighter, the wall is truer, and the night isn't nearly as long." He extended his right hand to her, palm up, the deep calluses on his fingers open and waiting. "If you join your name to mine, Rachel, every hour we have left will be pure profit. I want you to share this house with me, as my partner in the trade, and as my wife." Rachel looked at his broad, open palm, then raised her eyes to his. For the first time since she had walked onto his construction site 4 weeks ago, a soft, beautiful smile broke across her face, lighting up her hazel eyes with a quiet, unshakable joy. She did not hesitate. She placed her strong, sunburned hand into his, her fingers closing tightly around his palm. "The ledger balances, Gideon," she said, holding his gaze with absolute certainty. "It balances perfectly." They were married 3 days later, on a bright, crisp Sunday morning inside the finished county schoolhouse. There were no flowers, no lace dresses, and no large crowds. A traveling circuit preacher spoke the simple words of the service over them, while 2 retired stonemasons from the quarry stood as witnesses. Rachel wore a simple blue wool dress, her hair pinned back neat and smooth, while Gideon wore his single dark suit, looking broad, tall, and fiercely proud beside her. When the preacher asked for their vows, they did not read speeches from a book. They turned to each other, held each other's hands in a steady, firm grip, and spoke 2 words each that meant more than 1,000 grand declarations ever could: "I will." The narrative moved forward into the turning of the seasons, as autumn gave way to the sharp, clear cold of a prairie winter. The town that had once whispered behind its curtains about Rachel Sterling's unladylike trade soon found itself waiting in line at the newly opened office on the town square. Over the door hung a heavy, hand-carved oak sign, painted in gold leaf by Gideon's own hand: "Hale and Sterling, Stone and Plaster Works." They became the premier contractors of the valley. Together, they rebuilt the municipal centre, set the footings for 3 new churches, and built sturdy, fireproof stone homes for families across 2 counties. They worked side by side through every season, her light, precise plaster trowel complementing his heavy stone hammer, their shared labour a continuous, unspoken hymn of mutual respect and deep, enduring affection. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the western ridges and the cold wind began to howl across the open valley, They drove their heavy supply wagon back up the oak-lined track to their ranch. They cooked their meals together in the warm kitchen, kept their business ledgers together at the big oak table, and sat beside the stone fireplace Gideon had built with his own hands. Above them, glowing softly in the firelight, the white plaster oak leaves of Rachel's sealing medallion caught the warm light, a permanent symbol of the strength, beauty, and quiet peace they had built together on a foundation that no tremor in the world could ever shake down. Thank you for joining me for this story today, folks. There's a sweet kind of peace in knowing that when you build your life on a strong foundation of honest work and quiet respect, no tremor in the world can shake it down. May the Lord bless your home, keep your hands steady, and bring you a peace that lasts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who appreciates the old ways. Until next time, take good care.